On the evening of March 8, 2018, a signals intelligence station in northern Norway detected something that should not have existed. The facility, operated jointly by Norwegian Defence Intelligence and NATO monitoring units, maintained continuous surveillance of low-frequency transmissions across the North Atlantic and Arctic regions. At 21:47 Greenwich Mean Time, a receiver assigned to monitor obsolete Soviet-era frequencies registered a brief transmission lasting approximately 4 seconds. The signal was weak, distorted by atmospheric interference and what analysts later described as consistent with extreme underwater propagation delay. The frequency was 4,625 kHz, a bandwidth that had been abandoned by modern naval forces decades earlier. The duty officer, a veteran signals analyst with 18 years of experience monitoring Russian submarine communications, initially dismissed the reading as equipment malfunction or atmospheric echo. But protocol required documentation of all anomalies, and the signal was logged into the station's automated database. What made this transmission unusual was not merely its obsolete frequency, but its source identification prefix. The opening sequence, barely distinguishable through layers of distortion, matched a call sign that had not been active since 1968. The call sign belonged to K-437, a Soviet Gulf-class ballistic missile submarine that had disappeared in the North Atlantic 50 years earlier, presumed lost with all hands. The discovery triggered a series of quiet inquiries across NATO intelligence networks. Within 72 hours, the recording had been transmitted to the United States Naval Intelligence Office, the British Admiralty's Submarine Tracking Division, and a classified analysis unit within the Russian Ministry of Defense. None of these organizations issued public statements. The signal, if genuine, represented either an impossible technical anomaly or evidence that something about the 1968 incident had been fundamentally misunderstood for half a century. The submarine and its mission. K-437 was commissioned into the Soviet Northern Fleet in July 1965. It was a Gulf II-class diesel-electric submarine, one of 23 vessels of its type constructed during the late 1950s and early 1960s as part of the Soviet Union's strategic deterrent expansion. The submarine measured 300 feet in length, displaced approximately 2,300 tons when submerged, and carried a crew of 83 men. Its primary armament consisted of 3 R-21 submarine-launched ballistic missiles, each capable of delivering a nuclear warhead to targets at ranges exceeding 800 nautical miles. The Gulf-class boats represented the Soviet Navy's first credible sea-based nuclear deterrent, though by 1968 they were already being superseded by newer designs. The vessel's commanding officer was Captain Second Rank Vladimir Mikhailovich Kobzar, 41 years old, a career submariner with extensive experience in Arctic operations. His service record indicated 12 years of submarine duty, including multiple deployments into the Norwegian Sea and the Barents Sea operational zones. Kobzar was known within the Northern Fleet as a competent but cautious commander, someone who followed procedures precisely and avoided unnecessary risks. His executive officer, Captain Lieutenant Anatoly Belov, had served with Kobzar on a previous submarine and was considered equally reliable. The crew was composed primarily of conscripts completing their mandatory military service, alongside a corps of experienced enlisted personnel and warrant officers who maintained the submarine's complex mechanical and weapon systems. In early March 1968, K-437 was assigned to a routine strategic deterrent patrol in the North Atlantic. The mission orders, later partially declassified in Russian naval archives, directed the submarine to transit from its home base at Polyani, near Murmansk, to a patrol zone approximately 600 miles northwest of Scotland. The submarine was to maintain radio silence except for scheduled communication windows, operate at depth sufficient to avoid detection by NATO anti-submarine warfare assets, and remain on station for a projected duration of 60 days. The patrol was part of a broader Soviet naval exercise codenamed Ocean Shield, which involved multiple surface vessels and submarines conducting coordinated operations across the Atlantic. K-437 departed Polyani on March 2, 1968. Weather conditions in the Barents Sea were recorded as severe, with wind speeds exceeding 40 knots and sea states of 5 to 6 meters. The submarine submerged immediately upon clearing the harbor approaches and began its transit westward through the gap between Norway and Bear Island. This route, heavily monitored by NATO sonar networks, required careful navigation and precise adherence to noise discipline. Soviet doctrine emphasized operating at depths below the thermal layer to minimize acoustic detection, a technique that placed significant demands on the crew and the submarine's battery systems. The final confirmed transmission from K-437 was received by the Northern Fleet Communication Center at 3:15 Moscow time on March 8, 1968. The message was brief, formatted according to standard Soviet naval protocols, and transmitted via very low-frequency radio during a scheduled communication window. The content, according to reconstructed transcripts reviewed by Western intelligence analysts after the Cold War, indicated that the submarine had reached its assigned patrol area and was proceeding with operational tasking. The message included encoded position data, a status report on weapons and propulsion systems, and confirmation of receipt of the previous day's command directives. The transmission concluded with the expected authentication sequence. There were no indications of mechanical difficulty, no requests for assistance, and no deviations from routine reporting procedures. Approximately 6 hours later, at 9:30 Moscow time, the Northern Fleet attempted to establish contact with K-437 during another scheduled communication window. The submarine did not respond. Soviet naval communications protocols allowed for missed communication windows under certain operational circumstances, particularly if a submarine was conducting evasive maneuvers to avoid detection or if atmospheric conditions degraded radio propagation. The communications center logged the missed contact but did not immediately escalate the matter. By March 10th, K-437 had failed to respond to 3 consecutive scheduled transmissions. At this point, Northern Fleet Headquarters initiated contingency procedures for locating a submarine that had deviated from its communication schedule. A priority message was transmitted on multiple frequencies, directing K-437 to surface and report its position. The message was repeated at intervals throughout the day. There was no response. On March 11th, the Northern Fleet commander, Admiral Vasily Kasatonov, was briefed on the situation. He authorized the deployment of search assets, including long-range maritime patrol aircraft and 2 attack submarines, to the patrol area where K-437 was last known to have operated. The search operation was conducted under conditions of extreme secrecy. Soviet naval doctrine prohibited public acknowledgement of submarine losses, both to prevent intelligence leaks and to maintain the credibility of the strategic deterrent. Families of crew members were not immediately informed. The search aircraft, operating from bases in the Kola Peninsula, flew radar and magnetic anomaly detection patterns across an area of approximately 10,000 square nautical miles. The attack submarines conducted active sonar searches, a risky procedure that potentially revealed their own positions to NATO monitoring networks but was deemed necessary given the urgency of locating K-437. On March 14th, a Soviet Illinois 38 maritime patrol aircraft detected a possible underwater contact approximately 500 miles west of the Norwegian coast. The contact was weak and intermittent, consistent with a large metallic object resting on the ocean floor at significant depth. The aircraft deployed sonobuoys and recorded acoustic data that suggested the presence of a submarine hull. Coordinates were transmitted to Fleet Headquarters, and a salvage assessment team was assembled. However, when a specialized oceanographic research vessel arrived at the location 3 days later, it was unable to confirm the contact. The ocean depth in the area exceeded 4,000 meters, well beyond the operational limits of Soviet deep-sea recovery equipment available in 1968. By March 20th, the Northern Fleet officially classified K-437 as missing and presumed lost. A formal investigation commission was convened, chaired by a vice admiral from the main naval staff. The commission reviewed operational logs, maintenance records, and crew qualification files. It examined weather data, ocean current patterns, and potential mechanical failure modes. The investigation concluded, without definitive evidence, that the submarine had likely suffered a catastrophic casualty, possibly related to battery failure, flooding, or structural compromise during deep diving operations. The report noted that the Gulf-class submarines had experienced previous incidents involving electrical fires and pressure hull defects, though none had resulted in total loss prior to K-437. The official Soviet response to the loss of K-437 followed established patterns for managing submarine casualties during the Cold War. No public announcement was made. The families of the 83 crew members were informed individually, behind closed doors, by uniformed officers who provided minimal information and requested silence. The widows and parents were told that their loved ones had died in service to the Soviet Union, that the circumstances were classified for reasons of state security, and that public discussion of the incident would constitute a breach of military secrecy laws. Compensation was provided according to standard regulations, and the crew members were posthumously awarded decorations for service, though the citations were intentionally vague. Within the closed circles of Soviet naval intelligence, however, the loss of K-437 generated significant concern. The submarine had been carrying nuclear-armed ballistic missiles, and the possibility that these weapons might be recovered by Western intelligence agencies created a strategic vulnerability. Soviet leadership authorized a covert survey mission to locate the wreck and assess the feasibility of recovering sensitive materials. A specialized oceanographic vessel, operating under the cover of scientific research, was deployed to the suspected loss area in summer 1968. The vessel conducted deep-sea photography and sonar mapping, but the results remained classified. Western analysts, monitoring Soviet naval movements, noted the unusual activity but could not determine its purpose. The United States had detected the Soviet search operations through its network of underwater listening posts and signals intelligence platforms. The U.S. Navy Sound Surveillance System, a classified network of hydrophones placed on the ocean floor across strategic choke points, had recorded acoustic signatures consistent with a submarine implosion event on March 8, 1968. The recorded data indicated a sudden, high-energy acoustic pulse originating from a position in the North Atlantic, followed by the characteristic sounds of a hull collapsing under extreme pressure. American analysts cross-referenced the acoustic data with Soviet naval communications intercepts and concluded that a Soviet submarine had been lost. The U.S. response was to say nothing publicly while pursuing intelligence collection objectives covertly. The Central Intelligence Agency, in coordination with the Navy, initiated planning for a deep-sea recovery operation. The technical challenges were immense. The suspected wreck site was in water depths approaching 4,000 meters, far beyond the reach of conventional salvage equipment. The operation would require development of new technologies for deep ocean recovery, and it would need to be conducted without alerting Soviet surveillance. The program, eventually code-named Project Jennifer, became one of the most expensive and secretive intelligence operations of the Cold War. Neither government acknowledged the loss of K-437 to the international community. The Soviet Union maintained its policy of not confirming submarine casualties. The United States, possessing intelligence about the loss, chose not to disclose this information for reasons of operational security and intelligence source protection. The families of the crew existed in a bureaucratic void, knowing their relatives were dead but unable to learn the circumstances or visit a gravesite. The submarine itself became a classified notation in naval records, a vessel that had simply ceased to exist in any official capacity. The silence extended to the broader strategic relationship between the superpowers. The loss occurred during a period of heightened Cold War tensions. The Vietnam War was escalating, the Prague Spring would soon be crushed by Soviet tanks, and nuclear arsenals on both sides continued to expand. A submarine carrying nuclear missiles had been lost, and neither side could afford to acknowledge this reality without raising questions about command and control, weapon security, and the risks inherent in maintaining strategic deterrent patrols. The incident was buried beneath layers of classification, and the ocean kept its secrets. For the families of K-437's crew, the years following the loss were marked by enforced silence and bureaucratic obstruction. In the Soviet system, relatives of those who died in classified military incidents occupied an uncomfortable position. They were entitled to certain benefits as dependents of deceased servicemen, but they were prohibited from publicly acknowledging the circumstances of the deaths. Widows who remarried often did not tell their new families about their first husbands, not out of personal choice but because discussing classified information could result in criminal charges or loss of benefits. Yelena Kobzar, the widow of the submarine's captain, lived in Murmansk until her death in 1997. She raised their 2 children alone, working as a schoolteacher and maintaining the carefully constructed fiction that her husband had died in an unspecified training accident. She wrote letters to naval authorities requesting information about the location of the wreck, hoping that some form of memorial might be established. The letters were acknowledged with brief, standardized responses that provided no additional information. In the 1980s, as Soviet society began to experience limited openness under glasnost, she attempted to organize a group of families seeking information about submarine losses. The effort was quietly discouraged by naval authorities. In the United States, the intelligence community's interest in K-437 continued long after the initial recovery planning. Project Jennifer evolved into a major technical undertaking involving the construction of a specialized deep-sea recovery vessel, the Hughes Glomar Explorer, ostensibly built for deep ocean mining but actually designed to lift sections of the submarine from the ocean floor. The operation was conducted in summer 1974, 6 years after the loss. The mission succeeded in recovering a portion of the submarine's hull, though the extent of the recovery remained classified for decades. Materials retrieved included crew remains, equipment fragments, and potentially sensitive technical documentation. The recovered remains were analyzed by U.S. intelligence and subsequently buried at sea with full military honors in a classified ceremony. Photographs from the burial, eventually declassified in the 1990s, showed American naval personnel conducting a formal service for enemy submariners, an unusual gesture during the Cold War. The Soviet government was not informed of the recovery operation at the time it occurred, and when details eventually leaked to the press in 1975, both governments maintained positions of deliberate ambiguity about what had been recovered and what intelligence value it had provided. By the 1990s, with the Cold War ended and Soviet archives partially opened, historians and journalists began investigating submarine losses from the 1960s. K437 appeared in declassified documents as part of a larger pattern of Soviet submarine casualties during that era. Researchers identified at least 8 Soviet submarines lost between 1960 and 1970, most under circumstances that remained poorly understood. Western naval historians cross-referenced these losses with American acoustic monitoring data and concluded that the Soviet submarine force had suffered a casualty rate far higher than publicly acknowledged. The human cost was substantial. More than 500 Soviet submariners died in peacetime accidents during the Cold War, most in incidents that were never officially confirmed. The submarine itself, or what remained of it, rested at a depth of 3,800 meters in the North Atlantic. Ocean currents had likely dispersed debris across a wide area. The nuclear warheads carried by the missiles posed no significant environmental hazard, as the weapons had not detonated and their plutonium cores were contained within robust casings designed to withstand extreme conditions. The wreck site, its exact coordinates known only to Russian naval authorities and the U.S. intelligence agencies that had surveyed it, was effectively inaccessible to all. But the most sophisticated deep ocean exploration systems. The March 2018 signal detection initially appeared to be an isolated anomaly, the sort of unexplained radio phenomenon that monitoring stations record periodically and file away without resolution. But the Norwegian facility continued monitoring the frequency, and on April 3rd, another brief transmission was detected. This second signal lasted approximately 3 seconds and again matched the obsolete frequency parameters associated with Cold War-era Soviet submarine communications. The timing was notable. The transmission occurred at approximately the same time of day as the March detection, suggesting either a deliberate pattern or an automated system operating on a fixed schedule. Analysts at the Norwegian station submitted the data to NATO's Allied Maritime Command for technical evaluation. The recordings were processed through advanced signal analysis software designed to extract information from degraded or distorted transmissions. The analysis revealed that both signals contained structured data patterns consistent with encrypted military communications rather than random noise or natural radio phenomena. More significantly, the signal strength and propagation characteristics suggested an underwater origin, though the exact depth and location could not be determined from radio frequency analysis alone. The Russian Ministry of Defense, when queried through diplomatic channels about possible naval exercises or equipment tests that might explain the transmissions, denied any knowledge of operations in the relevant area. This denial was consistent with standard Russian policy of not confirming or denying specific military activities, but intelligence analysts noted that Russian naval activity in the North Atlantic had been relatively limited in 2018 compared to previous years. No Russian submarines were known to be operating in the region during the March and April transmission windows. By summer 2018, the matter had attracted the attention of a small group of specialists within Western intelligence agencies who maintained institutional knowledge of Cold War submarine incidents. One analyst at the U.S. Office of Naval Intelligence, reviewing the signal reports, noted the connection to K437 and began examining archived acoustic data from 1968. The process of comparing 50-year-old signal characteristics with modern detections required accessing classified databases that had been transferred from analog tape to digital formats over decades. The analyst's preliminary assessment concluded that the call sign identification, while partially obscured, matched the authentication codes used by Soviet submarines of the Gulf-class type. The coincidence of a signal apparently originating from a submarine known to have been lost 50 years earlier created several interpretive possibilities. The most conventional explanation was that someone, possibly a research vessel or amateur radio enthusiast, was transmitting on the old frequency and either deliberately or accidentally using signal parameters that mimic Soviet submarine communications. This explanation had precedent. Cold War radio frequencies were occasionally used by civilian operators unaware of their historical military significance. However, this theory could not easily account for the signal's underwater propagation characteristics or the precise replication of authentication codes that had been classified for decades. A second theory proposed that the signals were deliberate, either as a form of psychological operation or as a test of Western monitoring capabilities. Russian intelligence services had a history of conducting low-level provocations designed to probe NATO's detection networks and response protocols. Transmitting on obsolete frequencies associated with lost submarines could serve as a way to assess whether these frequencies were still monitored, and how quickly Western intelligence would recognize the significance. This theory had support among counterintelligence specialists who viewed the incident through the lens of contemporary Russian information warfare tactics. A third explanation, advanced cautiously and usually only in classified discussions, was that the signals represented some form of automated distress beacon or emergency system that had remained functional on the ocean floor for 50 years. Modern submarine designs included emergency systems designed to activate automatically in the event of catastrophic failure, though these systems typically had battery lives measured in days or weeks, not decades. However, some analysts noted that the Gulf-class submarines had been equipped with experimental systems in the 1960s, and complete technical documentation for these systems was not available to Western intelligence. The possibility that some form of long-life emergency beacon existed, powered by radioactive decay or some other exotic energy source, could not be entirely dismissed. In August 2018, a joint Norwegian-NATO research initiative deployed an oceanographic vessel to the approximate coordinates where the signal transmissions were believed to originate. The vessel, officially conducting marine geological surveys, was equipped with deep-sea sonar systems capable of detecting objects on the ocean floor at depths exceeding 4,000 meters. The survey area encompassed approximately 500 square nautical miles, centered on the coordinates associated with the last known position of K437 as recorded in partially declassified Soviet naval logs. The sonar survey identified multiple contacts consistent with man-made objects. The primary contact was a large metallic structure approximately 100 meters in length, resting at a depth of 3,780 meters. The object's dimensions and general shape were consistent with a submarine hull, though definitive identification would require closer examination with underwater imaging systems. Smaller debris fields were detected in the surrounding area, suggesting that the main wreck had experienced structural breakup either during the sinking or due to impact with the ocean floor. A remotely operated vehicle was deployed to conduct photographic reconnaissance of the primary contact. The ROV, capable of operating at depths up to 4,000 meters, required 8 hours to descend to the wreck site. The resulting imagery, captured with high-definition cameras and illuminated by powerful underwater lights, showed sections of a submarine hull heavily degraded by 50 years of exposure to seawater and pressure. Marine growth obscured many identifying features, but portions of the pressure hull, ballast tanks, and external piping remained recognizable. Most significantly, the imaging revealed what appeared to be an antenna array extending from the sail structure, suggesting that some communication equipment had survived the sinking intact. Engineers analyzing the ROV imagery noted several unusual features. The submarine's overall structural condition was better preserved than expected for a vessel that had presumably imploded during rapid descent. Most submarine losses involving catastrophic pressure hull failure resulted in severely fragmented wreckage, with the hull compressed and distorted by the forces of implosion. The K437 wreck showed damage consistent with impact and long-term corrosion, but major sections of the hull appeared to maintain their original shape. This suggested that the submarine might have sunk in a controlled manner rather than suffering explosive decompression, a scenario consistent with slow flooding rather than instantaneous structural failure. The antenna array presented a particular puzzle. Radio transmission from a depth of nearly 4,000 meters required specialized equipment and significant power. Standard submarine communication systems would not function at such depths due to the shielding effect of seawater, which rapidly attenuates radio waves. Low-frequency systems designed for communicating with deeply submerged submarines required massive shore-based transmitters and could only send signals to submarines, not receive them. For a submarine on the ocean floor to transmit a detectable signal to the surface would require either a trailing wire antenna extending into shallower water or some form of buoy system that had separated from the hull and floated to the surface. Researchers examined whether natural phenomena could explain the signals. Certain geological formations, when stressed by tectonic activity or underwater landslides, can generate electromagnetic pulses. However, these natural signals lack the structured patterns and frequency stability detected in the March and April transmissions. Volcanic activity in the region was minimal, and seismic monitoring networks had recorded no significant underwater earthquakes that might correlate with the signal events. The natural phenomena hypothesis was not entirely excluded but was considered unlikely by most specialists. The Russian government's official position remained unchanged: no knowledge of naval operations or equipment tests that would explain the signals. However, in private conversations between naval attachés, Russian officials suggested that if Western nations had information about the location of Soviet submarine wrecks, this information should be shared for humanitarian reasons to allow proper commemoration of the lost crews. This represented a subtle shift from Cold War-era postures, when acknowledging interest in wreck locations would have been seen as confirming sensitive information. The request went unfulfilled, as Western intelligence agencies were unwilling to disclose the full extent of their knowledge about Soviet submarine losses or the methods by which this knowledge had been obtained. The technical community examining the K437 signals divided into several schools of thought regarding the phenomenon's origin and nature. The divisions reflected both scientific evidence and institutional biases shaped by decades of intelligence work during and after the Cold War. The equipment theory held that the signals originated from abandoned or forgotten military equipment operating automatically on obsolete frequencies. Cold War-era military forces deployed thousands of unattended sensor systems, communication relays, and monitoring devices across strategic locations. Many of these systems were never properly decommissioned, and some remained intermittently active decades after their operational purpose had expired. Proponents of this theory noted that Soviet forces had deployed underwater acoustic monitoring devices throughout the North Atlantic, some of which incorporated radio transmission capabilities for relaying data to surface collection vessels. If such a device had been deployed near the K437 wreck site and remained functional, it might periodically transmit stored data or status reports on its original frequency. The theory struggled to explain why the transmissions included the submarine's call sign, unless the monitoring device had been specifically programmed to identify its deployment location using naval reference codes. The deception theory argued that the signals were deliberately fabricated as part of a contemporary intelligence operation. Modern signal processing and software-defined radio technology made it relatively straightforward to generate transmissions that mimicked historical communication patterns. A state-level intelligence service with access to classified Soviet signal parameters could replicate the authentication codes and frequency characteristics with high fidelity. The purpose of such a deception could range from testing NATO monitoring networks to creating confusion and diverting analytical resources toward investigating a false mystery. Critics of this theory questioned what strategic benefit would justify the operational risk and expense of conducting such a deception, particularly in an era when Russian intelligence priorities focused on more immediate geopolitical concerns rather than psychological operations involving 50-year-old submarine casualties. The autonomous systems theory proposed that the submarine itself, or equipment aboard it, contained long-duration power sources and automated systems that remained capable of limited function decades after the sinking. This theory drew on fragmentary intelligence about Soviet experiments with radioisotope thermoelectric generators for powering specialized equipment in remote or hostile environments. RTGs, which convert heat from radioactive decay into electricity, could theoretically provide power for decades with no maintenance. If K437 had been equipped with experimental communication equipment powered by an RTG, and if this equipment had been programmed to transmit periodic status reports, the system might continue operating indefinitely. The theory faced significant objections from naval engineers who noted that underwater corrosion would likely degrade electronic components and antenna systems long before power sources were exhausted. Additionally, no declassified Soviet technical documentation confirmed the use of RTGs on Gulf-class submarines, though the absence of documentation did not definitively prove such systems were never installed. The acoustic misidentification theory suggested that the detected signals were not radio transmissions at all, but rather acoustic phenomena misinterpreted by monitoring equipment. Underwater volcanic activity, whale vocalizations, and man-made sounds from shipping or seismic survey equipment could potentially generate acoustic signatures that, when picked up by hydrophones or underwater listening devices, might be converted to electrical signals that propagated to the surface and were detected by radio monitoring stations. This theory required a complex chain of coincidental factors to explain the signal characteristics, and most analysts considered it possible but unlikely. A fifth perspective, rarely articulated in official reports but discussed informally among veterans of Cold War intelligence operations, held that the full truth about K437's loss had never been disclosed and that the signals might relate to aspects of the incident still protected by classification. This view noted that both Soviet and American intelligence services had conducted extensive operations related to submarine losses, including recovery missions, wreck site surveillance, and technical exploitation. It was possible that equipment deployed during these operations remained active, or that the incident involved complexities not reflected in partially declassified documents. Advocates of this perspective cautioned against drawing conclusions based on incomplete information, and suggested that the true explanation might only emerge if additional archives were opened in the future. By 2018, most of the immediate families of K-437's crew had passed away. The widows who had received notification of their husbands' deaths in 1968 were, if still living, in their 80s or 90s. The children of the crew, who had been young in 1968, were now approaching 70. The generation that had lived through the immediate trauma of the loss was aging out, and with them, the personal memory of the incident was fading. Marina Belov, daughter of Executive Officer Anatoly Belov, was 64 in 2018. She lived in St. Petersburg and worked as a librarian. Her father had been 33 when K-437 disappeared, and Marina retained only fragmented memories of him, his uniform, his voice on the telephone during infrequent calls home, the photograph her mother kept on the mantel. She had learned of her father's death from her mother, who provided almost no details except that he had died serving his country and that Marina should be proud. As a child, she had not understood the silence, the absence of a funeral, the way her mother's face would close whenever she asked questions. In the 1990s, after the Soviet Union collapsed, Marina began researching submarine losses, hoping to learn something concrete about what had happened. She visited naval archives in Moscow, wrote letters to veterans organizations, and eventually connected with other families of submarine casualties through informal networks. The information she gathered was incomplete and often contradictory, but she established that her father's submarine had been lost somewhere in the North Atlantic and that the wreck had possibly been located by American intelligence. She wrote to the Russian Ministry of Defense requesting confirmation of the wreck site coordinates so that a memorial service might be conducted. The ministry replied that the information remained classified for national security reasons. When news of the 2018 signal detections reached Russian media through unofficial channels, Marina contacted naval authorities again, asking whether the reports might indicate that something had been misunderstood about the incident. The inquiry went unanswered. She considered traveling to Norway to speak with researchers involved in the investigation, but ultimately concluded that she would learn nothing new. The pattern of silence and official indifference that had characterized her entire life would continue. Her father was gone, the submarine was gone, and whatever the signals meant, they would not bring closure. In the United States, the intelligence community's long involvement with K-437 through Project Jennifer and subsequent wreck site monitoring meant that American personnel had their own complex relationship with the incident. Several of the analysts and engineers who had worked on the 1974 recovery operation published memoirs or gave interviews after classification restrictions were partially lifted in the 1990s. They described the technical challenges of deep-sea recovery, the ethical questions about disturbing a war grave, and the surreal experience of handling artifacts from an enemy submarine while conducting funeral honors for its crew. One former CIA officer, writing under a pseudonym in a 2010 memoir, reflected on the underwater burial ceremony conducted after recovering remains from the K-437 wreck. He described the tension between viewing Soviet submariners as adversaries in an ideological struggle and recognizing them as fellow sailors who had died far from home. The ceremony, conducted on the deck of the Glomar Explorer with no media presence and no official record, had been planned by the ship's captain and carried out with genuine solemnity. A chaplain read prayers, the remains were placed in weighted caskets, and they were lowered into the ocean with military honors. The author noted that many of the Americans present found the ceremony emotionally affecting, a moment when the abstractions of Cold War conflict gave way to recognition of shared humanity. Soviet veterans who had known members of K-437's crew gradually aged and died without public acknowledgement of their lost comrades. The Soviet Navy's tradition of secrecy regarding submarine casualties meant that even within naval circles, discussing specific losses was discouraged. Submariners who served in the Northern Fleet during the 1960s knew that boats sometimes did not return, but the details were not shared, and speculation was dangerous. In the post-Soviet era, some veterans organized informal memorials and published limited circulation books documenting submarine losses. These efforts were tolerated by authorities but received little official support or recognition. The investigation into the 2018 signals continued intermittently through 2019 and 2020, though with declining intensity as other intelligence priorities drew resources away. No additional transmissions were detected after April 2018, suggesting that whatever had generated the signals had either ceased functioning or was operating on an irregular schedule that did not align with monitoring coverage. The Norwegian facility maintained automated surveillance of the relevant frequencies, but no human analysts were assigned to full-time monitoring. Several practical questions remained unresolved. If the signals had originated from equipment at the wreck site, what had powered them for 50 years? If they were deliberate deceptions, who had conducted them and for what purpose? If they were natural phenomena or equipment malfunctions, Why had they manifested with such specificity regarding frequency and authentication codes? The available evidence supported multiple interpretations but conclusively proved none. Ocean scientists noted that deep-sea environments remain among the least understood regions of the planet. More humans have walked on the Moon than have descended to the average depth of the Atlantic Ocean floor. The conditions at 3,700 meters depth, near freezing temperatures, complete darkness, and crushing pressure exceeding 370 atmospheres, create an environment fundamentally hostile to human exploration. Equipment deployed to such depths operates at the limits of engineering capability, and long-duration monitoring is technically challenging and expensive. The wreck of K437 itself, whether or not it was connected to the signals, represented a technological time capsule from the Cold War. Soviet submarine design from the 1960s incorporated systems and approaches that reflected the state of naval technology before the revolution in electronics and material science that occurred over subsequent decades. Some aspects of 1960s submarine design, particularly in areas like emergency systems and passive survivability, were never fully documented in Western intelligence assessments. The possibility that Soviet engineers had incorporated features or capabilities not anticipated by Western analysts could not be excluded. The geopolitical context of the signal detections also merited consideration. In 2018, relations between Russia and NATO had deteriorated significantly compared to the post-Cold War thaw of the 1990s. The conflict in Ukraine, incidents involving Russian military aircraft near NATO airspace, and multiple allegations of Russian intelligence operations in Western countries had created an atmosphere of renewed distrust. Against this background, anomalous signals associated with Soviet military hardware acquired additional significance beyond their technical characteristics. Any incident involving Russian military systems, even systems 50 years obsolete, was analyzed not only for what it revealed about technology but also for what it might indicate about intentions and capabilities. Intelligence professionals familiar with the history of submarine losses noted that K437 was not unique in remaining mysterious decades after its sinking. Multiple submarine casualties from the Cold War era remained incompletely explained. The USS Scorpion, lost in 1968 within months of K437's disappearance, was discovered by U.S. Navy search operations, but the cause of its loss remained disputed. The Soviet submarine K-8, lost in 1970, sank after a fire in the Atlantic, and its wreck was surveyed multiple times by Soviet and later Russian expeditions, but details about its final moments were unclear. The French submarine Minerve disappeared in 1968 in the Mediterranean and was only located in 2019, more than 50 years after its loss. Each of these incidents left families without answers and historians with incomplete records. The North Atlantic in winter is a realm of persistent storms, grey horizons, and seas that have claimed vessels for as long as humans have ventured onto water. The ocean floor at the depth where K437 rests is covered with fine sediment, accumulated over millennia, occasionally disturbed by deep currents or underwater avalanches. The submarine, once a product of advanced technology and human ambition, has become part of this landscape, slowly corroding, gradually being buried by sediment, transforming from artifact to geology. Deep-sea exploration has revealed that the ocean floor is not the desolate wasteland once imagined. Complex ecosystems exist even at extreme depths, supported by chemical energy from hydrothermal vents or organic matter that drifts down from the sunlit layers above. Wreck sites, including sunken submarines, become artificial reefs, colonized by organisms that find shelter and surfaces for attachment. The wreck of K437, if it follows patterns observed at other deep-sea wreck sites, likely hosts communities of deep-sea creatures, amphipods, fish, and possibly larger animals like octopuses that make use of the structure. The submarine has become part of the ocean's ecology, serving a purpose its designers never intended. The crews of submarines lost during the Cold War shared certain characteristics regardless of nationality. They were overwhelmingly young men, often in their 20s or early 30s, who had volunteered for service that required technical skill, physical endurance, and psychological resilience. Life aboard a submarine during extended patrols was difficult. Cramped quarters, limited privacy, irregular sleep schedules, and the constant awareness that survival depended on complex machinery functioning correctly in an unforgiving environment. The men who served on K437 knew these conditions and accepted them as the cost of their service. Their final moments, whatever form they took, remain unknowable without direct evidence. The scenarios proposed by accident investigators, flooding, fire, structural failure, are reconstructions based on statistical analysis and engineering judgment, not witnessed events. Whether the end came suddenly, with no time for comprehension, or gradually, with the crew struggling against rising water and failing systems, can only be inferred. The ocean does not preserve such details. The 2018 signals, if they were genuinely connected to the submarine, represented a form of communication across an incomprehensible gulf, 50 years of time, thousands of meters of water, and the boundary between life and death. That such communication might be possible, even in a purely technical sense, challenges assumptions about permanence and finality. The Cold War ended, the Soviet Union dissolved, the ideological conflict that gave meaning to strategic deterrent patrols became history, yet signals emerged suggesting that some element of the past had not entirely ceased to exist. The families who lost fathers, husbands, and sons to submarine casualties during the Cold War largely exhausted their grief decades ago. The acute pain of loss eventually transforms into a duller, more manageable absence. The unanswered questions remain, but they lose urgency as life continues and new generations with no personal connection to the events come of age. The signals detected in 2018, whatever their origin, did not provide the answers families had sought. They added another layer of mystery to an incident already obscured by classification and time. The submarine that vanished in March 1968 has not returned, whatever the signals might suggest. K437 rests on the Atlantic floor, broken and corroding, inhabited by creatures that have no concept of human ambition or Cold War rivalry. The 83 men who sailed aboard it are gone, their remains either buried at the wreck site or committed to the sea by American sailors during a classified recovery operation. The strategic imperatives that sent the submarine on its final patrol are artifacts of history, studied by academics and memorialized in museums, but no longer active forces in international relations. The mystery of the signals remains open. Official investigations have produced no definitive conclusions, and classified findings, if they exist, have not been disclosed. The incident serves as a reminder that the technological infrastructure of the 20th century has not entirely disappeared. Millions of artifacts from the Cold War, sensors, weapons, communication devices, and vehicles, remain scattered across the planet, some still functional, others degraded but not entirely inert. As these artifacts age, they occasionally generate anomalies that resist easy explanation. The ocean itself remains largely unmapped and poorly understood. Only a small fraction of the deep-sea floor has been surveyed with sufficient resolution to identify objects the size of a submarine. Wreck sites from conflicts spanning centuries rest on the bottom, most unknown and unvisited. The technology to reach these depths exists but is expensive and limited. Future generations may develop capabilities that make deep-sea exploration routine, but at present, the ocean floor remains one of the least accessible environments on Earth. The human dimension of submarine losses extends beyond the individuals directly affected. Every submarine that went to sea during the Cold War carried the weight of geopolitical conflict, technological competition, and institutional demands for secrecy. The men who served aboard these vessels were instruments of national policy, but they were also individuals with families, aspirations, and inner lives that had nothing to do with strategic deterrence. When submarines were lost, both dimensions were erased simultaneously, the strategic asset and the human beings who operated it. The signals detected in 2018 suggest that closure is illusory when dealing with events that were never fully disclosed. The Cold War generated countless secrets, most of which have never been and likely never will be completely revealed. Archives remain closed, witnesses die, and institutional memory fades. What survives is fragmentary, declassified documents with redacted sections, testimony from participants with incomplete knowledge, and physical artifacts whose context has been lost. K437 will eventually dissolve entirely into the ocean, a process that will take centuries but is ultimately inevitable. The steel of the pressure hull will oxidize and disperse. The equipment will corrode away. The nuclear warheads, more resistant to decay, will persist longer but will eventually be buried under sediment. In time, no physical trace will remain. The submarine will exist only in records and memory, and as those two fade, it will cease to exist in any meaningful sense. Until then, monitoring stations in northern Norway and elsewhere will continue recording radio frequencies, including those abandoned decades ago. Automated systems will log anomalies, generate reports, and store data in archives that may or may not ever be reviewed. If the signals return, they will be documented, analyzed, and filed away. And the ocean will keep its secrets, as it always has, indifferent to human efforts to extract meaning from the depths.